Most men don't realize they've changed their life forever, until an alien princess wakes up and tells them they're already married. The desert moon of Kestrel, 9 was the kind of place maps forgot and corporations ignored, a quiet rock drifting at the far edge of human trade routes nearly 40 million miles from the nearest shipping lane, where the wind carried the dry hiss of powdered crystal across endless gray dunes and the night sky burned with unfamiliar constellations that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Jack Walker liked it that way. No crowds, no politics, no admirals asking questions about past missions best left buried. Just salvage. Just quiet work. His rust-scarred utility ship, the Rust Line, rested on its landing struts beside the fractured remains of something much older, an alien vessel half swallowed by sand and time. Jack wiped the dust from his gloves and checked the cracked display on his scanner. A faint energy pulse blinked across the screen, weak but steady, somewhere beneath the collapsed hull. "That's new," he muttered to himself. Salvage work had taught him 2 rules that kept a man alive: if something was glowing, it probably still worked, and if it still worked, it might still be valuable. He climbed through a torn corridor of twisted alloy where the metal walls hummed faintly with trapped heat. The air inside the wreck smelled of ozone and mineral dust, like a lightning strike trapped in a cave. His boots crunched across fragments of crystalline circuitry until the scanner chirped again, louder now, guiding him toward a sealed chamber half buried under debris. The door had cracked open just enough for a human to squeeze through. Jack slipped inside and froze. In the center of the chamber stood a pillar of translucent blue crystal, 6 feet tall and glowing softly like frozen moonlight. Inside it, perfectly still, was a woman. Not human. Her skin held a faint sapphire hue, smooth and luminous under the crystal light, and delicate silver markings traced along her arms like living constellations. Long pale hair floated weightless around her shoulders as if gravity had politely stepped aside. She looked peaceful, almost asleep, yet the scanner in Jack's hand insisted she was alive. Barely. "Well, that's a first," he whispered. The crystal casing pulsed again, weaker this time. A warning indicator flickered along its surface in symbols Jack didn't understand but could recognize as universal. Trouble. Whatever this thing was, it was failing. He circled the pillar slowly, studying the seams along its base. The structure wasn't a coffin. It was containment. Or maybe protection. Jack exhaled slowly, staring at the silent figure inside. Walking away would be the smart move. Unknown alien technology, unknown alien politics, unknown alien consequences. But the faint pulse on his scanner grew weaker with every passing second. "Yeah," he sighed, setting his tool kit on the ground. "Guess today's the day I make a bad decision." He knelt beside the base of the crystal and pried open a maintenance panel, revealing a web of organic circuitry glowing dimly beneath the surface. One carefully placed surge from his portable power cell might restart it, or shatter it. Jack hesitated for only a moment before connecting the leads. A sharp hum filled the chamber as energy surged through the structure. The crystal cracked with a sound like distant thunder. Light spilled across the room. The pillar fractured, dissolving into glittering shards that evaporated in the air like frost under sunlight. The woman inside collapsed forward, and Jack caught her before she hit the ground. She was warm. Very warm. Her eyes snapped open instantly, glowing violet in the dim chamber. Before Jack could even speak, she sat upright in his arms with the sharp reflex of someone trained for battle, staring at him with stunned disbelief. Then she said something in a language that sounded like music striking glass. A small device on her collar flickered, translating the words a second later into clear, calm English. "Human," she said slowly, studying his face as if confirming an ancient rumor had suddenly become real. Jack blinked. Hi." The alien woman straightened, her gaze sharpening with sudden realization as she looked at the broken crystal chamber around them. Then she looked back at him. For a long moment she said nothing. Finally she spoke again, voice steady, almost ceremonial. "You broke the preservation seal and saved my life." Jack rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, about that. Sorry if that was some kind of royal freezer. The woman tilted her head, violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim chamber. And then she said the sentence that made Jack Walker realize his quiet salvage job had just become something much, much bigger. Human, she said calmly, you have just married me. Jack Walker blinked. Twice, because sometimes the human brain needed a moment to decide whether it had heard something real or something completely ridiculous carried in on thin desert air. He slowly released his grip on the alien woman and leaned back a few inches, studying her face to make sure she was not joking. She did not look like someone who joked often. Her violet eyes remained fixed on him with the calm seriousness of a person announcing the weather. Jack cleared his throat. I am sorry, he said carefully, speaking each word slowly as if the translator might be the problem. What exactly did you say just happened? The woman straightened her posture with a quiet dignity that made the broken salvage chamber feel suddenly smaller. Even sitting on the dusty floor she carried herself like someone who had spent her entire life being obeyed. The glowing lines along her sapphire skin brightened faintly as the translation device at her collar flickered again. According to the law of my people, she explained, the individual who breaks the royal preservation seal and restores the life of a Valari heir becomes their bonded consort. Jack stared at her for a long moment. Outside the fractured hull of the alien ship, the wind of Kestrel 9 sighed through the dunes like a tired ghost. Inside the chamber, silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally Jack rubbed his face with both hands. Okay, he said slowly. Let me see if I understand this correctly. I showed up looking for scrap metal. I found you frozen in a glowing crystal tube. I helped you because you looked like you were about to die. And now you are telling me that makes me your husband. The alien woman considered his words with quiet patience. That is correct. Jack let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Well, that seems like a pretty important rule to mention on the warning label. She tilted her head slightly. The chamber does display 14 separate warnings in the Valari language. Jack looked back at the shattered crystal fragments scattered across the floor. Yeah. I am going to admit something here. I do not read Valari. For the first time a small flicker of something crossed her expression. Not anger. Not amusement. Something closer to curiosity. She studied him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You knew nothing of our customs, she said slowly. And yet you still chose to open the chamber. Jack shrugged. You were alive in there. Barely, she replied. The preservation seal had only minutes of energy remaining. Jack leaned against a twisted support beam and folded his arms. Well then I guess that means my timing was pretty good. The alien woman rose carefully to her feet, testing her balance as if the gravity of the moon still felt unfamiliar. She stood nearly as tall as Jack, maybe an inch shorter, her silver hair catching the dim blue light that still glowed from the dying systems in the chamber. When she spoke again her voice carried the calm weight of someone used to command. My name is Elira Valari. First daughter of the Valari High Throne. Jack blinked again. Of course you are. She continued as if that explained everything. Your action has legally bound you to the royal line. Jack scratched the back of his neck and glanced toward the exit of the wrecked ship where the desert light filtered through torn metal walls. Princess, he said carefully, I do not want to make this awkward, but where I come from people usually get to know each other first. Elira studied him for a long quiet moment. The wind outside carried a long whisper across the hull like distant ocean waves. Then she said something unexpected. Human Jack Walker, she said softly, reading the name printed on the chest patch of his work jacket. You misunderstand. Jack raised an eyebrow. I do. Elira's violet eyes held his steadily. The law does not say you must marry me. She paused just long enough for Jack to feel hopeful. Then she finished the sentence with perfect calm. It says that you already have. Jack Walker stood there for a long moment trying to process the sentence that had just calmly rearranged his entire life. The wind outside the broken hull sighed through the alien wreck again, carrying grains of pale dust across the metal floor while the last glowing fragments of the shattered crystal chamber slowly faded into dim sparks of light. He looked at the alien woman standing in front of him, tall, composed, and completely serious. Nothing in her expression suggested humor. Nothing suggested doubt. Jack rubbed the back of his neck again, a habit he had developed years ago whenever a situation made absolutely no sense. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let me say this out loud so I know I am not losing my mind. You are a princess from some advanced alien civilization, and according to a law I have never heard of, the moment I opened that crystal tube I apparently signed up for marriage without even filling out paperwork." Elira watched him quietly, her glowing violet eyes steady and attentive, like a scientist observing a new species react to unexpected information. "Your understanding is essentially accurate," she replied. Jack let out a breath through his nose and glanced toward the cracked doorway where sunlight from the desert moon spilled across the floor in a pale silver stripe. "You know where I come from," he said. "Marriage usually involves a conversation first." Elira stepped forward slightly, studying the strange human who had just disrupted an ancient royal ritual without even realizing it. Up close she could see the small details that made him different from the warriors and diplomats of her own world. The worn stitching on his jacket. The dust across his boots. The faint smell of engine coolant and desert wind that clung to his clothes. Nothing about him suggested power or status. Yet he had chosen to break the seal anyway. "The preservation chamber exists for one purpose," she explained calmly. "If a member of the royal bloodline is critically endangered, the chamber protects their life until rescue arrives. The one who breaks the seal accepts responsibility for that life." Jack nodded slowly. "Right. Responsibility, I understand. That part makes sense." She paused, her silver hair shifting softly as the breeze from the broken hull moved through the room. "For the Valari people, the highest form of responsibility is partnership." Jack gave a quiet laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. "Where I come from, that conversation usually happens after dinner." Elira considered that information with visible curiosity. "Human customs appear inefficient." Jack pointed toward the broken crystal fragments scattered across the floor. "Human customs also usually involve asking permission before someone becomes a royal husband." For a moment neither of them spoke. The salvage chamber hummed quietly as damaged alien systems slowly powered down. Finally Jack folded his arms and looked back at her. "Let me ask you something honestly," he said. "If I had walked away and left you in that chamber, what would have happened?" Elira answered without hesitation. "The chamber would have failed within minutes." Jack nodded once. "That is what I thought." He glanced toward the open desert again, then back at her calm, glowing eyes. "So the real reason that law exists is to make sure whoever saves you cannot just disappear afterward." Elira studied him with new interest. "You understand quickly." Jack shrugged. "I run a salvage ship for a living. You learn to read the fine print." He walked across the chamber and picked up one of the fading crystal shards, watching the dim light inside it slowly fade like a dying star. "But here is the problem," he said. "I am not a prince. I am not a diplomat. I am a guy with a rusty cargo ship parked outside and a fuel tank that barely lasts a week." He looked up at her again. "Your law might say we are married." Elira waited silently. Jack tossed the fading shard aside and dusted off his hands. "But something tells me your people are not going to be thrilled about the idea that their princess just married a salvage mechanic on a forgotten desert moon." Elira did not answer right away. Instead she looked past him toward the distant horizon visible through the broken hull where the sky had begun to shimmer faintly with movement. Small points of light were appearing high above the desert. Jack followed her gaze and squinted. "Please tell me that is not what I think it is." Elira spoke softly, her voice calm but unmistakably certain. "Those are royal search vessels." Jack sighed slowly. "Well," he said, "I guess we are about to find out how the in-laws feel about me." Jack Walker squinted at the sky for several seconds, hoping his tired eyes were playing tricks on him, but the lights above the desert of Kestrel 9 only grew brighter as they descended through the thin atmosphere like silent falling stars. There were not just one or two of them either. There were many. Smooth silver shapes glided through the upper clouds in perfect formation, their hulls catching the pale sunlight and reflecting it across the dunes like moving mirrors. Jack slowly lowered his hand from his forehead and looked at Ailira again. "When you said royal search vessels," he said carefully, "you were not exaggerating." Ailira followed the descending lights with a calm expression that seemed completely out of place for someone who had just awakened inside a broken alien ship on a forgotten desert moon. "The High Throne does not lose track of its heirs easily," she replied. Jack nodded once. "That makes sense." He gestured toward the sky again. "But I have to ask. Is it normal for them to bring half a fleet just to check on you?" Ailira studied the approaching ships quietly. "My disappearance would have been considered a matter of extreme concern." Jack gave a quiet laugh that held a hint of disbelief. "Concern. That is a very polite word for this many ships." The lights above them grew larger, resolving into elegant vessels shaped like curved wings of polished metal. Their engines produced no thunder or flame, only a low harmonic vibration that rolled gently across the desert like distant music. Jack had spent years traveling the outer systems and he had seen plenty of spacecraft in his time, but nothing like these. The design looked almost alive. "Well," he muttered, "there goes my quiet afternoon." Ailira turned her attention back to him, studying his reaction with open curiosity. "You appear calm," she observed. Jack shrugged. "When you run salvage in the outer colonies you learn something important." "What is that?" she asked. "Panicking never fixes the situation." Jack walked toward the torn opening of the wrecked ship and looked out across the open dunes. His own vessel, the Rust Line, sat about 200 yards away where he had left it earlier that morning, its hull scratched and faded under years of hard work. Compared to the graceful alien ships descending from orbit it looked like an old pickup truck parked beside a fleet of luxury yachts. He folded his arms and watched as the first of the alien craft slowed overhead, hovering silently several hundred feet above the sand. "So," he said without looking back, "what usually happens when a princess shows up with an unexpected husband?" Ailira stepped beside him, her silver hair catching the breeze as she looked up at the hovering vessels. "The High Council will want confirmation of the bond." Jack sighed softly. "Of course they will." The air around them began to shimmer as one of the ships lowered a circular beam of soft blue light toward the desert floor. It was not threatening. It was precise and deliberate, like a spotlight searching for something important. Jack watched it sweep slowly across the dunes until it reached the broken alien wreck where they stood. The light paused there as if it had finally found what it was looking for. Jack tilted his head slightly. "That seems official." Ailira nodded once. "They have located us." Jack took a slow breath and rubbed the dust from his hands onto his jacket. "All right then." He glanced down at her glowing violet eyes and managed a small smile that carried more curiosity than fear. "I guess it is time for me to meet your family." Ailira looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. "Human Jack Walker," she said, her voice calm but thoughtful, "you may be the first human in history to say those words while standing in the middle of a royal retrieval operation." Jack looked back up at the massive ships floating silently above the desert. "Yeah," he said softly. "Somehow that does not surprise me." The blue beam of light settled gently onto the sand beside the broken alien wreck, illuminating the desert floor in a soft circular glow about 20 feet wide. Jack Walker watched it with the cautious curiosity of a man who had spent enough years around strange technology to know that the quiet machines were usually the most powerful ones. The hovering ship above them adjusted position slightly, its smooth silver hull turning almost lazily in the sky like a bird gliding on invisible currents. There was no roar of engines, no blast of heat, only that low musical vibration humming through the air. Jack shifted his weight and glanced at Ailira. "So what exactly happens next?" he asked. "Do they send down a welcoming committee or just a very polite arrest squad?" Ailira kept her eyes on the beam of light as if recognizing a familiar ritual. "Neither," she replied calmly. "They will send an envoy first." Jack folded his arms. "An envoy sounds official." The glowing circle brightened for a moment and then slowly condensed into a tall column of shimmering particles that drifted downward from the hovering vessel. The particles gathered together about 10 feet away, forming a clear silhouette before solidifying into the shape of a tall Valari figure dressed in layered silver armor that reflected the desert sunlight in smooth ripples. The figure stood perfectly still for a moment, scanning the environment with calm precision before lowering its head respectfully toward Ailira. "Your Highness," the newcomer said, the translator at its collar converting the elegant alien language into calm English. "The fleet has searched 3 systems for you. We are relieved to find you alive." Jack raised an eyebrow slightly. "Well, that is one way to make an entrance." Ailira stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone returning to a role she had held her entire life. "Commander Salvar," she said, recognizing the officer instantly. "Your arrival is timely." The tall Valari officer straightened slightly. His luminous eyes briefly shifted toward Jack, studying him with open curiosity before returning his focus to the princess. "We detected the failure of the preservation chamber and immediately traced the signal here," Salvar explained. "Your safety has been the priority of the High Throne." Jack leaned casually against the broken frame of the alien wreck, feeling very aware that he was the only human within several million miles. "Good to know the rescue service works," he muttered quietly. Salvar finally turned fully toward him, his gaze thoughtful rather than hostile. "And this individual," the commander said carefully, "is the one responsible for opening the chamber." Ailira answered without hesitation. "Yes." Salvar studied Jack for several seconds, his expression calm but clearly evaluating every detail from the dust on his jacket to the worn boots that had walked across half the outer colonies. "Human," Salvar said politely, "your actions restored the life of a royal heir." Jack gave a small shrug. She looked like she needed help. The commander's expression shifted slightly, as if that answer had not been the one he expected. "You were aware of the Valari preservation law before breaking the chamber seal?" Jack shook his head immediately. "No, sir. I was absolutely not aware." Salvar's glowing eyes flickered briefly toward Ailira. The princess met his gaze without hesitation. "The human acted without knowledge of the law," she confirmed. The commander was silent for a moment, processing that information. Above them the fleet continued hovering quietly in the sky like a gathering of silent stars. Finally Salvar spoke again, his voice still calm but noticeably more serious. "Then the situation is unusual." Jack let out a quiet breath and nodded slowly. "You are telling me?" Salvar looked from Jack to Ailira again, then back to the human standing casually beside the shattered remains of the royal preservation chamber. "Regardless of the circumstances," the commander said carefully, "the ancient law of the Valari is clear." Jack rubbed his forehead slightly, already guessing where this conversation was going. Salvar inclined his head toward him with formal respect. "Human Jack Walker," the commander said, "according to the law of our people, you are now bound to the royal bloodline." Jack looked up at the massive fleet floating silently above the desert and sighed softly. "Yeah," he said, "that part has been coming up a lot today." Jack Walker listened to the alien commander finish speaking, and for a moment the only sound in the broken wreck was the wind sliding through twisted metal beams and the distant harmonic hum of the royal ships hovering above the desert. He slowly looked from Commander Salvar to Ailira and then up at the sky again as if checking whether the universe planned to add any more surprises before the day was over. "All right," Jack said finally, brushing the dust from his hands. Let me try to keep this simple because I feel like the only person here who did not study alien law in school. Commander Salvage remained perfectly still, watching him with the composed patience of an officer who had dealt with many strange situations across many star systems. Jack pointed toward the shattered remains of the crystal chamber behind him. I saw someone in trouble. I helped. That is the entire story. Salvage nodded slightly. Your actions are not in question. Jack raised a finger. Good. Because I would really prefer not to be on trial for basic decency. The Valari commander considered that statement carefully. You misunderstand the nature of the law, he said. It is not punishment. It is recognition. Jack let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Recognition usually comes with a certificate or maybe a thank you card. Not marriage. Beside him Ailira watched the conversation quietly, her violet eyes moving between the human salvage pilot and the officer who had served her family for years. There was a thoughtful calm in her expression, as if she were studying both of them at once. Salvage turned slightly toward her. Your Highness, he said with respectful formality, the fleet stands ready to escort you home immediately. The Council will wish to confirm your recovery. Ailira nodded once. That is expected. Jack shifted his weight and glanced toward his ship resting alone on the desert 200 yards away. The rust line looked smaller than ever beneath the shadow of the hovering alien vessels, its faded hull scratched from years of hauling scrap across forgotten moons. Before everyone starts planning the royal return trip, Jack said slowly, there is something we should probably talk about. Salvage looked at him again. Speak. Jack took a breath and folded his arms. Where I come from people get to choose who they marry. The desert wind carried a soft wave of sand across the ground as the commander considered that statement. Choice exists within Valari law, Salvage replied calmly. Jack raised an eyebrow. Really? Because so far it sounds pretty automatic. Salvage gestured lightly toward the shattered chamber. The preservation law was created thousands of years ago for a reason. Only someone willing to risk themselves for another life will open that seal. Jack glanced down at the fading crystal fragments again. Or someone who does not know what the warning labels say. For the first time the corner of Salvage's mouth shifted slightly, as if the human's honesty had caught him off guard. Ailira stepped forward then, her voice calm but firm as she addressed them both. The human speaks truth, she said. Both men looked at her. She continued quietly, her gaze steady. Jack Walker did not act because of law or reward. He acted because he saw someone in danger. The desert seemed to fall completely silent around them as the princess finished speaking. Salvage studied her carefully, recognizing the tone she used only when she had reached a decision. Your Highness, he said cautiously, are you suggesting the bond should be reconsidered? Ailira looked at Jack then, meeting his uncertain expression with calm clarity. No, she replied softly. I am suggesting the Council will have to understand something new. Jack blinked. And what is that? Ailira's silver hair moved gently in the desert wind as she answered. That the human who accidentally married their princess might also be the only person who never intended to. Jack Walker stood quietly for a moment after Ailira finished speaking, the desert wind brushing against his jacket while the silent fleet hovered high above them like a gathering of distant moons. He had never imagined that a routine salvage job could turn into a conversation about royal laws and accidental marriages, yet somehow the universe had decided that today was exactly that kind of day. He rubbed the side of his neck again and looked at Ailira with a small, uncertain smile. You know, he said slowly, most people back home say the universe works in mysterious ways. I just never expected it to involve alien royalty. Commander Salvage remained still, processing the princess's words carefully. The officer had served the Valari throne for decades and had witnessed many unusual political complications, but even he had to admit that a human salvage pilot accidentally triggering an ancient marriage bond was something entirely new. His gaze shifted between Ailira and Jack before returning to the princess. Your Highness, he said respectfully, the council will require a full explanation. Ailira nodded once. They will receive one. Jack looked toward the hovering ships again, watching their elegant shapes drift slowly through the high atmosphere. The sunlight reflected across their curved hulls in long shimmering lines that stretched across the desert floor like quiet rivers of light. Those ships look expensive, he said thoughtfully. Selvar followed his gaze. They are vessels of the royal fleet. Jack chuckled softly. Yeah, I figured that part out. He paused for a moment before adding, I just want to be clear about something before anyone flies me halfway across the galaxy. Both Valari turned toward him. Jack lifted a hand slightly. I did not save her because I expected a reward. I did not even know who she was. Ailira's eyes remained steady on him. Jack continued, speaking with the calm honesty that had guided most of his life decisions. Where I come from, if someone is in trouble, you help them. That is the entire rule. The wind moved gently across the dunes again, carrying grains of pale sand across the wreckage of the ancient ship. Selvar studied the human carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than suspicious. Your reasoning is simple, the commander said. But simplicity does not make it insignificant. Jack shrugged. It is just the way things should work. For a moment none of them spoke. The desert stretched endlessly around them, quiet and open beneath the hovering alien fleet. Then Ailira stepped a little closer to Jack, her voice calm but carrying a quiet weight that neither man missed. Commander Selvar. She said, prepare a transport. Selvar nodded immediately. Yes, Your Highness. Jack blinked once. Transport to where exactly? Ailira looked up toward the nearest royal vessel drifting gracefully above the wreck. Home. Jack scratched the back of his head slowly. You mean your home? Ailira turned back to him with the faintest hint of a smile forming at the corner of her lips. Our situation has made that distinction complicated. Jack exhaled quietly and glanced once more at the rustline sitting alone across the sand. The old salvage ship had carried him across dozens of lonely worlds, and until this morning he had expected it to carry him across dozens more. Now the future looked very different. He turned back to Ailira and nodded once. All right, he said. But if I am going to meet an alien royal council, I should probably warn you about something. Ailira tilted her head slightly. What is that? Jack smiled faintly. I have absolutely no idea how to behave around royalty. Ailira's violet eyes reflected the sunlight as she answered calmly. That may be the reason the ancient law chose you. The beam of light widened across the sand as the royal vessel above them adjusted position, lowering a circular platform that shimmered gently like liquid glass. The air hummed softly around it, not loud, not threatening, just powerful in a quiet and controlled way that reminded Jack Walker of machines built by people who had mastered their technology long ago. He stood beside Ailira at the edge of the broken wreck and looked up at the descending transport with a slow whistle. That, he said thoughtfully, is a lot nicer than the ladder on my ship. Commander Selvar stepped toward the glowing platform first, inspecting it with practiced calm before turning back toward the princess. The transport is ready, Your Highness, he said. Ailira nodded once and then looked toward the rustline sitting across the desert, its faded metal hull reflecting the distant sunlight in dull patches. Your vessel, she said quietly to Jack. Jack followed her gaze and shrugged slightly. She is not pretty, but she gets the job done. The wind moved through the dunes again, brushing fine sand across the landing struts of the old salvage ship that had carried him across half the outer colonies. For years it had been his entire world. Now it looked strangely small. Beside the silent fleet hovering above the desert sky. Jack rubbed the back of his neck once more and took a slow breath. I guess I should lock it up before I leave, he said casually. Selvar looked at him with mild confusion. Lock it. Jack nodded. Human habit. Ailira watched him walk across the sand toward the rustline with an expression that carried a hint of curiosity. She had grown up in palaces built from living crystal and energy fields that responded instantly to royal command. The idea of a person physically securing a door with a simple mechanical lock was oddly fascinating. Jack climbed the short ramp into his ship and disappeared inside for a moment. The interior lights flickered on as he moved through the narrow corridor, checking panels and switches out of pure habit. The rust line was not elegant, but every scratch in its metal walls carried a story. Finally he stepped back out onto the ramp and tapped the hull gently with his hand. "All right, old girl," he murmured softly, "looks like we are taking a little detour." He sealed the hatch and turned back toward the waiting transport. Ailira studied his face as he approached again. "You care for that vessel," she observed. Jack shrugged. "It has kept me alive longer than most jobs." Salvage gestured toward the glowing platform again. "We should depart before the desert winds strengthen." Jack nodded and stepped onto the platform beside Ailira. The surface felt solid beneath his boots even though faint waves of light moved through it like reflections across water. For a moment nothing happened. Then the light brightened and the desert slowly began to fall away beneath them as the platform rose smoothly into the sky. Jack looked down as the broken wreck and the rust line grew smaller beneath his feet. The endless dunes of Kestrel 9 stretched toward the horizon in pale golden lines that seemed to ripple like a quiet ocean. "Well," he said softly, "this is definitely the strangest elevator I have ever used." Ailira watched the desert shrink below them before turning her gaze toward the massive royal ship waiting above. Its hull curved gracefully through the sky, vast enough to cast a long shadow across the clouds beneath it. "Human Jack Walker," she said calmly, "the next time your life changes, I suspect it will not happen on a desert moon." Jack glanced at the enormous vessel waiting above them and gave a quiet laugh. "Princess," he replied, "after today I am starting to believe that anything is possible." The platform rose smoothly through the pale sky of Kestrel 9 until the desert below became nothing more than soft golden lines stretched across the surface of the moon. Jack Walker kept his hands loosely at his sides while the air hummed quietly around the transport beam, the sensation somewhere between standing in sunlight and floating in calm water. Above them the royal vessel waited like a drifting continent of silver metal, its curved surface reflecting the stars even in daylight. As the platform reached the ship, a circular gateway opened silently along the hull and the beam guided them gently into a wide reception chamber filled with soft blue light. The moment Jack stepped off the platform he paused instinctively, his boots touching a floor so polished it looked almost liquid. The chamber stretched nearly 100 feet across, lined with tall arching structures that glowed faintly like living crystal. Through a long transparent wall he could see the fleet outside, dozens of elegant ships hovering around the flagship like silent guardians. Jack let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly, "this is definitely nicer than the cargo bay of the Rust Line." Commander Salvar walked ahead with calm precision while Ailira stepped beside Jack, her posture relaxed now that she had returned to familiar surroundings. Several Volari officers stood waiting at the far end of the chamber, their silver uniforms reflecting the ambient light as they bowed respectfully when the princess approached. Jack noticed that every pair of glowing eyes in the room eventually turned toward him. He raised one hand slightly in a polite gesture. "Hello," he said with a faint smile. The officers studied him carefully, their curiosity obvious but controlled. To them he was something entirely new, a human standing calmly inside a royal vessel as the unexpected consort of their princess. Salvar stopped beside a tall crystalline console and activated a communication field that projected a circular halo of light into the center of the room. Within seconds the halo filled with faint silhouettes of distant figures seated in a grand chamber somewhere far away among the stars. The High Council had joined the transmission. Ailira stepped forward and inclined her head respectfully. "Members of the Council," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the quiet chamber. "I have been recovered safely." One of the glowing silhouettes leaned forward slightly. "We see that you have," the voice replied, ancient and composed. "Our sensors also confirm that the preservation seal was broken by a human." Jack shifted his weight slightly but remained quiet. Ailira glanced briefly toward him before answering. That is correct. Another council voice spoke. Then according to the ancient preservation law the human is now bound to the royal line. The chamber remained silent as the council waited for confirmation. Ailira straightened and spoke clearly. Yes. Jack felt every pair of alien eyes shift toward him again. Finally one of the council figures addressed him directly. Human Jack Walker, the voice said slowly, did you know the consequences of opening the chamber? Jack shook his head honestly. No sir. I just saw someone who needed help. There was a long pause across the transmission as the council processed that simple answer. Then the same voice spoke again, softer this time. You acted without expectation of reward. Jack shrugged slightly. Where I come from that is how helping works. The chamber remained quiet for several seconds. Then the council figure turned back toward Ailira. Princess, the voice said thoughtfully, the law has chosen an unusual partner for the throne. Ailira looked at Jack for a brief moment before answering with quiet certainty. Perhaps the law simply recognized what matters. Jack glanced through the transparent wall at the endless stars surrounding the ship and allowed himself a small thoughtful smile. A few hours earlier he had been alone on a dusty salvage job at the edge of known space. Now he stood inside a royal flagship surrounded by an alien civilization that had suddenly decided he belonged to them. He folded his arms comfortably and looked back toward the council. For what it is worth, he said calmly, I am still figuring this out too. Somewhere beyond the glass wall the stars stretched endlessly across the galaxy, silent and bright, and for the first time since the strange day had begun Jack Walker realized